this computer. Okay. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Sandra Monge. She is a community resource specialist at a local library in the San Gabriel Valley. And you guys submitted some questions. So we're going to go ahead and ask Sandra your questions and let's go ahead and get started. So Sandra, thank you for joining us today.
Absolutely. Good evening. It's good to be here
Yes.
with you.
So how long have you been a community resource specialist for the library?
Okay, so I've been in this particular role since about October of 2018. So going on over like close to 5.5 years.
Wow,
Yeah,
it's been that long.
it's really flown by. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then what led you to seeking a position within a library?
It wasn't so much the setting itself. I think it was the role for the program, for the particular program within the library, specialized in being knowledgeable on like community resources. And with my previous background, having worked for several nonprofits, working with the aging population, children and families, adolescents and their parents. I was kind of very familiar with a lot of resources, linkages, so it seemed like a good fit.
Mhm.
And so that's what led me to apply for that role.
Okay. That kind of answers what other clinical settings have you worked in to prepare you for working at the library in your
Mhm.
capacity?
So yeah, so I worked for a lot of other social service organization nonprofits. I worked for a Head Start agency in Orange County. San Gabriel Valley, I worked with an organization providing services to the aging, as well as an organization that was specializing in providing like psychoeducation and parent education to teens and to their parents.
Oh, I didn't even know all that.
Mhm,
All
mhm.
right. So what types of social services do you provide? Do you offer individual counseling or is it more of a case management?
So we don't provide in-house mental health services or counseling. We are able to connect our patrons to to anyone who's interested in that. We were happy to connect them, but nothing in-house. We provide linkages to like employment services, housing, like legal aid for situations that involve evictions, senior services, family services, helping our patrons connect through to programs through like Department of Social Services, which would include like GR benefits, Medi-Cal, um, CalFresh for those experiencing food insecurity. And for like our seniors, we can help them connect or, give them knowledge about the programs that are out there related to like in-home supportive services, which would provide like a caregiver to kind of help care for their needs. And that's just a
Okay.
snippet, we
Yeah.
often get a lot of inquiries for just very random situations that will lead for us to have to do research, consult, make some phone calls in order to try to find that particular resource for them as well.
That kind of goes into this other question that
Uh-huh.
asks about during this current climate of inflation, housing shortages, and wages, applications for social services are often complicated, confusing, and
Mhm.
stressful. Are you able to help those in difficult circumstances find the aid they need in most situations, they might, even if they might not have the often extensive documentation that aid programs require? So I guess basically, can you help people even if they don't have all the paperwork they need?
Yeah, a lot of times if there is a lack of certain paperwork, that's not something we can necessarily bypass. We would kind of help them to obtain that information, whether it's, I know that they can access Department of Social Services with an ID. I don't know that they need to present their Social Security card, but we would help them hopefully get a replacement of their ID, getting things situated because all of that documentation is pretty important, for example, for folks who are unhoused and they want to connect to permanent housing programs or other support services, like having those documents in order is going to be important. But in terms of the application process for some of the, programs through DPSS, we are happy to kind of assist them, explain um, the applications, if there's issues with literacy or language barriers, we are able to facilitate that help to get those documents completed. in order for them to successfully connect to those programs.
Right. And then this question, I know this was always been a struggle when I was there with you. Do you have a private office at the library? If not, how do you manage confidentiality of patrons and clients?
Yes, which is super important, right?
Right.
One of our areas, it is like a open common area. We do have a designated space, but often we are discussing very personal, private things. So we do have a private space that we share it. So it's not a designated office for my particular program. So in situations where that space is unavailable, we have to be very creative on like alternate meeting spaces when we do need that privacy. Which will have me kind of running around the library looking for a
Mhm.
private space to meet. It can even look like us going outside. We're situated next to a park. We may need to, sit at a bench outside. So I don't necessarily have a very specific office that I can rely on at all times. I'm lucky sometimes when I am able to use it, but we have to become creative sometimes when, finding a private space. And giving our patrons an option of holding that meeting in that, open public space,
Mhm.
and letting them decide if they feel comfortable with that or not. If we talk in a very low voice and being discreet so that others don't hear us. So we also give them a choice to decide where they want to hold that meeting.
Okay. And most of the time, are people okay just meeting out in the open, or do you
They're
think
usually okay with it. And a
they are?
lot of
Okay.
times, if I do note that they're speaking in a higher tone where folks are listening or hearing in, I will kind of remind them. Usually
Right.
they're okay with it. They don't care, you know, but,
Right.
I will remind them just about just that confidentiality and respecting their privacy. And
Right.
in terms of confidentiality, right, I am also a mandated reporter. So there are limits to confidentiality, even within my meeting with our patrons. I'm obligated to report cases of elder abuse, dependent adult abuse, and abuse of children, suicidal ideation, and homicidal ideation. So that's kind of something I have to share with all of the patrons we meet with, and they do sign a consent form understanding the limits of confidentiality in our meeting.
Okay. And not to get personal or anything like that, but not to bring any, but have you had
Uh-huh.
instances where you've had to report
Oh,
situations?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of those cases have revolved mostly around like elder abuse.
Okay. Interesting.
A lot of
Wow.
calls to adult protective services. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
kind of
very
sad.
sadly, we'll have a lot of elderly patrons who come seeking support services from myself and my colleague, and we'll give them the disclaimer, and they will still share, what the situation is. A lot of times, there's financial abuse where a family member is um, taking their money, or they've taken over their home. They've had them sign certain paperwork where they've legally signed over their
Mm,
home to a child, or there's emotional abuse. So we have to report those cases.
okay. So, given the sensitivity of people when they are experiencing financial trauma,
Mhm.
how do you go about providing outreach to those who could benefit from your help and expertise? And is it difficult to approach people in crisis?
So our outreach mainly consists of building partnerships within our community, right? So a lot of other community organizations know about our program, so we'll get a lot of referrals that come in through that route. We also do frequent presentations to our local schools, our school district, where we will attend the parent meetings and, kind of showcase the support services available to our program. Um, and what was the last part of that question?
Let me go back. Sorry. Is it difficult to approach people in crisis?
Okay, yeah, absolutely. So I feel like a lot of times when, our clients or our patrons are experiencing some level of, financial insecurity, financial crisis, they're at risk of becoming homeless or evictions. They're a lot of times very anxious, agitated, and sometimes they might project some of that onto you, right? So for me in my role, I think it's important to kind of validate their experience,
Mhm.
validate how scary, how difficult their experience might be, but also trying to kind of reassure them that there are programs out there that can hopefully assist them through whatever situation that they're going through, and kind of just giving them a space to discuss this, validating it, and maybe reflecting of what they're going through.
And I
Or
know
some of
that,
our clinical, right? Some of my
right.
clinical skills that we have to put into practice. Although I'm not a clinician in this role, outside of this, I do have some experience in that field, but I can apply some of those skills
And
in the
we were talking about this in class, and my previous person that I interviewed talked about
Mhm.
de-escalating
Mhm.
situations and how sometimes library staff isn't equipped for that. Do you
Yeah.
feel that staff has asked you to come in and kind of help de-escalate some patron interactions,
No,
perhaps?
not quite. I think what we are leaning towards is definitely creating a space for more trainings for our staff to be better equipped to de-escalate and how to handle these situations. Maybe how to practice kind of soothing after they've had difficult exchanges with patrons as well, having like some coping skills, ways to kind of just ground themselves after they've had kind of a stressful encounter.
Okay.
I know I haven't myself been responsible for any of the trainings. I know that our management has talked to consultants and other parties to come in and actually provide trainings for our staff all around those topics and themes.
Okay.
Mhm.
Um, and then in terms of financial assistance,
Mhm.
I know that in the past there was hotel vouchers available, but there is a fine line as to who qualifies for those, correct? In
Right,
terms,
yeah, so we didn't have the voucher. There was a
oh,
program that was providing like temporary stays for a local motel. It was a very small grant, so it did allow us to provide temporary housing to those who were more at risk, which would be like the classification for that were families, with small children, the elderly, and disabled adults, right? And so that was something that we did have access to. Currently, there is a partnership between our city and a service provider for the unhoused, who does outreach in our community, who has access to HMIS, to Clarity. Those are the databases that are shared for the coordinated entry system for providers of services to the unhoused. So
mhm.
they are able to enroll them in HMIS. They're able to also locate shelter beds, drive them to local food banks, drive them to DPSS. So that is a
Okay,
great partnership that we've had that has allowed us to expand the services and reach those who are unhoused.
that's great. I didn't know all that. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Okay, and let's see. Oh, this is a good one. What are some professional boundaries you have had to set with patrons and with colleagues?
Professional boundaries. Well, that's like a given with all of our encounters with patrons, right? Is like
Right,
not sharing personal information, when they want to pry or ask questions about your personal life, you can always set a very polite boundary as to the reason why we're meeting.
right.
And so kind of redirect the purpose of that meeting. Um, in terms of with professional boundaries, I don't think I've ever been in a position that I've had to in this particular role, like
Uh,
establish firm boundaries that, around my profession.
okay. I know with patrons, it can always be touch and go with
Yes,
that.
yes. Sometimes they're very curious, sometimes they're inappropriate. So we always have to know how to handle those situations, know when we need to talk to our management or know when we need to talk to security at any time that we feel unsafe.
So, reflecting on the spectrum of your duties, what tasks do you find most fulfilling and which present the most obstacles?
So the biggest obstacles would be those where we are trying to connect to services that are highly impacted, like housing, like services for the unhoused. My limitations within my role that kind of limit me and limit my access to some of those programs that I really rely on another organization to connect to those programs. I know that affordable housing is one of the biggest kind of areas of need that we see, with our program patrons. And the reality is that those programs move very slowly, like the wait list for affordable housing, how you have to register, how you kind of have to keep connected to your application, where you're at in the wait list, responding to certain correspondence. So if you have folks who maybe aren't computer savvy, who move around a lot, they sometimes can lose touch with that process, and it's hard for them to, to maintain kind of like that momentum in getting connected to those programs. So that's very frustrating. Telling our patrons how long that process really looks like in terms
Right.
of the fulfilling part is, when we are successful in many of our cases, not just some, many of our cases, we do see successes where we've connected folks, like mostly seniors, to affordable housing units. We've been able to connect families who were at risk of homelessness, who were kind of going through that eviction process, connecting them to organizations that have come through with rental subsidies, rental arrears, utility assistance, connecting to mental health services. So there's a lot of great successes within that too, that give us a lot of pride in what we do. And it's kind of what motivates us and pushes us to continue to do what we do.
On an average, how many people do you think you see per week?
It varies. A lot of times we see a lot of repeat patrons. We have our frequent visitors, but I would say that we see anywhere from like 20 to 25 per week.
And it's all by appointment.
A walk-in appointment, and it's myself and a part-time colleague. So we have
Okay.
a community resource specialist.
Okay. And what do you think, besides housing, what's the second most need that you see?
Employment. A lot of folks are struggling with employment. So we don't necessarily do in-house employment services. We're helping link them to organizations that specialize in employment development, like American Job Centers or local adult schools. We can provide some kind of education around what it's like to apply for jobs online. Resume building, we may give some information on that, but we really want to connect them to organizations that really specialize in that field.
And during your whole 5 years that you've been there, what do you find to be like the most successful case you've ever had?
Most successful case is probably related to securing permanent affordable housing for an elderly gentleman who was living in a shed. I think he was like renting a little makeshift shed that didn't have a restroom, didn't have a kitchen. He wasn't allowed to use the restroom within the main home, so he'd have to kind of build his day around going to the restroom at restaurants, buying food in restaurants, and have a space to cook healthy food. And so he very diligently applied to many, many places. Like he was very good on, just following through on everything he had to do. He must have submitted like 30 applications. And within the span of like 2.5 years, he was finally connected to permanent affordable housing unit in San Bernardino County.
Okay. So
Mm-hmm.
you're able to help them not within not only LA County,
Mm-hmm.
but you can get them somewhere else. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
And then I think those were most of the questions, but do you have anything else you want to add about your role there at the library or what you do or how your feelings towards, being
It's a
like,
very dynamic role, right? And it's
right.
one that I've
Yeah.
it's evolved too, right? Since I started within that program, I'm happy to see the way it's also kind of evolved with me as, I finished like my studies and my master's and, continuing on and, accruing my hours for my LCSW, how it's kind of grown with me along the way where we're able to use my skills that have kind of also developed over time and being able to apply those into my role there with the program. I do see the challenges for librarians. I definitely see how it can be a very challenging role where if you don't have a social worker within your site, like how difficult it might be to navigate all of these different systems for folks who visit the library and, being like a hub of information,
Mhm.
right? And how difficult it might be to navigate these systems that librarians might not be familiar with, and how crucial and essential it is to have a person, with that background in that type of a setting.
And you offer services to not just residents of the city that your library is in, correct? Anyone can
Yeah,
come
no,
there.
there's no restrictions. There are some programs that we do have restrictions, but for the most part, anyone can visit and obtain like resources and information.
And the people who come in to request help, do they all have to be over 18 or can a teen come in and ask for help?
I think there are some limits for teens in terms of what kind of resources they're trying to connect to. Yeah. But
Okay.
typically we would prefer that there is an adult present.
Okay.
And depending on the situation, it might even result in a call to Child Protective Services if it's a minor.
Okay. If it's a minor. Okay. I think, well, how has being bilingual also been beneficial?
Oh, it's very beneficial. A lot of, I would say that over 50% of our visitors are primarily monolingual Spanish speakers. So having knowledge and being able to read documents in Spanish, write in Spanish has been very instrumental in the work I do and serving our population.
When you make like when you help them out, do they ever need you to be like a translator? And if so, how does that work as like your limitations to how much you can help them with in terms of that?
So I can just be an interpreter as long as they give permission on the line for me to kind of interpret that phone call.
Okay.
Makes sense,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the interview?
Nothing else that I can think of.
All right. Well, thank you, Sandra, for spending time with us
Absolutely.
today. And I think they're going to enjoy this, getting more of a better insight of what it's like to be a social worker or a community resource specialist at a library from what I just told them and what they read to actually get it from somebody who deals with this on a daily basis. So thank you. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.